"Kathryn," her mother softly called. The girl jumped on the bed, springs creaking. Her mother seemed to glow from within with a warm, gentle light. But why was she here in the middle of the night? "Kathryn," her mother whispered again. She looked exactly the same as she did a month ago, on the day Kathryn had last seen her. Her favorite dress, neatly arranged hair, a delicate string of pearls around her neck. Her eyes sparkled in the darkness, and her breath was uneven, as if she were in a hurry. Had she sensed the boredom and loneliness here at summer camp and decided to visit her daughter? "I'm here for just a little while, my dear. I'll stay with you. Is that all right?" Her mother draped a blanket over Kathryn's pajamas, and they stepped outside. The night was cool, but her mother held her daughter close. Instantly, a sense of warmth and comfort enveloped them. Moonlight bathed the clearing where a bench stood beneath a tree. "How beautiful it is here, Kathryn," her mother said. "Do you like it?" "Yes, Mom, but I miss you and Dad." She lowered her head and unexpectedly felt a touch of sadness, though there was no real reason to be sad. "My child, how will you manage without me? Why should I be alone?" Kathryn didn't understand. "The camp session is almost over, and we'll be together again." "Well, you never know. Maybe I'll have to go somewhere." "Don't leave, Mom." Kathryn closed her eyes. Her mother continued to embrace her. Kathryn felt the wet touch of her mother's kiss on her cheek. "I'll always be with you. I love you more than life itself, and that love will never change." "Well, I must go now." Kathryn opened her eyes. She was in her bed at home. The door was firmly closed, and her mother wasn't nearby. What was this? An incredible dream that felt so real. It was frightening now, after 25 years, to recall those days, both terrifying and difficult. Entering her father's house, Kathryn felt as though she had been transported back into that time, into that uncertainty, those fears, that intense pain and enduring resentment. Resentment that had curled up deep within her soul for a time and remained silent. Kathryn rarely brought these memories to the surface, fearing to touch them too often. But why bother? They said time healed wounds, and she had relied on the majesty of time, whose course couldn't be slowed or halted. Back then, in the morning, she had rushed to find her mother. There was so much she needed to share. However, Iris was nowhere to be found. In the kitchen, Kathryn found her grandmother, Alice, making pancakes. Yes, she adored her cooking, especially the thin, lacy pancakes with strawberry jam. But to have Grandma Alice making them here, in her mother's kitchen. Grandma only visited on holidays, no more than 2 or 3 times a year. She would quickly hand her granddaughter gifts, have tea, and within a few hours, she would leave despite everyone's insistence. The idea of her cooking something in her son's house was unthinkable. Mom always called Alice the perfect mother-in-law, and only many years later did Kathryn truly understand the profound meaning of those words. And suddenly, there was Grandma Alice in an apron, right there in the kitchen. Something was definitely amiss. The girl didn't have to rack her brains for long. Grandma, carefully choosing her words, informed Kathryn that her mother was in the hospital. Kathryn was bewildered. What could have happened in the few hours she'd been asleep? After all, her mother had been perfectly healthy and happy the day before. She scrutinized her father's and grandmother's faces, trying to understand if they were hiding something important. Her heart was uneasy. When she asked her father to take her to the hospital, he refused, sharply and sternly. No matter how long Kathryn stared into his darkened eyes, she couldn't discern anything in their deep blueness. "Kathryn, your mother is not allowed visitors right now. Please be patient," Grandma Alice added, patting her head. Kathryn plunged into her grandmother's warm embrace, once again marveling at the twists of fate. Mobile phones were a luxury at the time, and not everyone could afford them. But Iris definitely had one. Kathryn remembered that. The device was large, with a long antenna. But when she asked her father to call her mother, he sighed heavily, tiredly removed his stylish glasses, blinked, rubbed his face with his pudgy, white hands, then placed his glasses back on and replied that the hospital phone wasn't working. And that distracted Kathryn. Alexander had changed the topic, choosing not to elaborate. He had looked thoughtful, subdued for the past few days. He attributed it to work problems, spending evenings in his favorite armchair, lost in thought, remaining silent. Father's best friend, Anderson, frequently visited them. They would close themselves in the study, and loud, incomprehensible conversations would drift out. That morning was transparent, truly peaceful as summer dawn, imbued with optimism, unaware of any impending trouble. From early morning, relatives began to gather at their home without any reason for celebration. The holidays were far away, yet guests started arriving in large numbers, almost simultaneously. That morning, her father entered her room, sat down next to Kathryn, and told her that her mother had passed away. Kathryn remembered Grandma frozen in the doorway, her pale face resembling a cream mask, much like the ones her mother sometimes applied. How could this be? Her mother wasn't supposed to die. It was just a dream, a very vivid one. She pinched herself and yelped in pain. Rain drummed on the windows, keeping a deliberate rhythm, as if nature itself was mourning an irreparable loss, leaving behind only an impenetrable void. Kathryn remembered the events of the following days poorly. In fact, for many years she tried to erase fragments of the past from her memory. The ugly plastic wreaths, the acrid smell of some smoke in the temple, the sticky brown clay underfoot, the bottomless, damp pit into which the coffin was lowered. After the funeral, her father became withdrawn, hardly talked to anyone, and stopped going to work. Kathryn understood more and more clearly that misfortune had befallen their home, and in reality, it hadn't gone anywhere. "He loved your mother deeply," sighed Grams Alice, discreetly wiping away her tears. Anderson still visited them every evening, encouraging her father as best as he could. Kathryn saw unfamiliar faces around her. They brought her unnecessary, utterly useless things that brought no joy whatsoever. She wanted to cry, but the tears wouldn't come. There was only a terrible pain in her chest, as if a hole had formed there, letting in a whistling black wind, alternately icy and scorching. 2 years later, her father remarried. Gabriel moved into their home. She had visited before, but Kathryn had paid her no attention whatsoever at the time. Now she had to accept the fact that Gabriel was now part of their family, permanently living under the same roof. Her new stepmother tried to find common ground with Kathryn, but all efforts were in vain. Kathryn seemed to sense the insincerity. Gabriel was unpleasant and incomprehensible to her. Her good mood could change in a second. There was a pervasive lack of understanding, unresolved issues, resentment, and dissatisfaction between them. The rapid remarriage of her father was another blow for Kathryn. She perceived it as a betrayal of her mother's memory that her father had brought another woman into their home. Everyone spoke about the same thing, that this young woman was interested in her father only for one thing. At that time, her father was the mayor's assistant, and oddly enough, Gabriel's career skyrocketed. Her position as a receptionist was quickly replaced by a specially created role as a youth policy advisor. On one of her birthdays, her father gifted her a car. Gabriel shopped at the finest boutiques and played the role of a loving young wife fairly well, seemingly unfazed by the nearly 20-year age difference. However, Gabriel's attempts to befriend her stepdaughter were fruitless. She bought Kathryn cosmetics, sweets, secretly allowed her to watch TV late into the night, and tried to be secretive as if they were girlfriends. Time passed, and at first, Kathryn learned to tolerate her, and then she just stopped noticing Gabriel's presence in the house. Her stepmother seemed content with this arrangement. Gabriel would disappear for whole days, wandering around shopping malls, beauty salons, and restaurants. It was believed that she was working. After all, that's why Alexander had secured that job for her. But work didn't really occupy her precious time. The stepmother was more focused on her own appearance and indulging in various pleasures. Her father came to accept this, for he believed that a beautiful woman, according to Gabriel's view, was not meant for hard work. Her primary role was to be his wife. Cooking, apparently, also fell under the category of arduous labor, as Gabriel neither knew nor wanted to cook. She constantly went on diets, and if she didn't eat out, she subsisted on vegetables and fruits. This motivated Kathryn to learn how to cook. Her mother had managed to teach her some simple dishes. However, the meals turned out delicious. Alexander couldn't have been happier that homemade food was back in the house, and for Kathryn, it was another way to earn her father's praise. Her father's praise was a significant incentive in Kathryn's school life, and Alexander spared no joy, celebrating each of his daughter's achievements. Every evening before sleep, Kathryn mentally told her mother about her day. Sometimes she spoke aloud. These weren't monologues. The presence of her mother was so vivid that Kathryn felt as if she could feel her touch. When there were 2 years left before finishing school, Kathryn informed her father that she planned to become an illustrator artist and intended to apply to the Institute of Culture. It was the first time she faced strong opposition from her father. Initially, he expressed his displeasure and then gently, from different angles, tried to convince her that tying her life to art was simply unreasonable. He steered her towards a more promising profession, outlining its benefits and his potential support. Ultimately, Kathryn gave in. She enrolled in a prestigious university's economics department. Life took a different turn. Studies, new friends, outings, theaters. Alexander rented an apartment for Kathryn. Nonetheless, by her second year, Kathryn began to earn extra money, not even for the money itself. Though she took pride in her modest earnings, she wanted to meet her father's expectations. She saw how he tried so hard for her, rejoiced in her every success. Deep down, perhaps she realized that an economist wasn't the profession she had dreamt of, but since this path was chosen, she had to pursue the set goal to the end. Her diligent studies yielded expected results. Kathryn graduated with honors. Soon, she was working at a major company where she had completed her internship during her 5th year. For her successful studies, Alexander gifted his daughter an apartment and a car for Christmas. Her father's support was truly invaluable. After a year of work, she bought tickets to Prague. There, standing on Charles Bridge, Kathryn met a guy named Bernard. Coincidentally, he not only lived in the same city where he worked as a lawyer, but he was also staying at the same hotel as her. Kathryn and Bernard spent the entire trip together, and a few months after returning home, they got married. A year later, their first child, Calvin, was born. Now Kathryn was in the role of a mother. She experienced every facet of her love for her baby uniquely, understanding just how fragile maternal happiness could be. Kathryn visited her father rarely. However, becoming a grandfather seemed to shake Alexander. He seemed to realize just how fleeting time could be. Soon, Gabriel and Alexander had a daughter, Valeria, and a couple of years later, Elizabeth was born. The father was happy, but motherhood was a burden for Gabriel. She loved her daughters, but this new role didn't align with her life's priorities. Now Gabriel had to let go of endless parties, travels, and the need for beauty salons. Why bother with those procedures when you spent your days at home with the children? Alexander was strictly against hiring a nanny, stating that it was the mother's exclusive duty to care for the daughters. And mind you, he was fully supporting her. Gabriel bore the hardships of motherhood with resilience and then delved into spiritual development, seeking enlightenment. For several months, she encouraged her household to switch to a plant-based diet, meditated every morning, and practiced yoga with a teacher, or more accurately, a spiritual mentor who came to their home daily for a material reward. Initially, Alexander turned a blind eye to his wife's newfound interest. He tried to retreat to another room to avoid the monotonous sounds accompanying her practices. Yoga sessions lasted an hour, but after a few weeks, they began to consume almost half a day. Moreover, during these sessions, the mentor locked himself in a separate room with his pupil. Gradually, suspicions began to grow in Alexander's mind that Gabriel and the seemingly harmless mentor weren't merely engaging in spiritual pursuits. Before he could uncover the truth, one morning his wife disappeared, leaving a note that she had gone with him to India for a few months. Kathryn didn't know how her father reacted, but she could confidently assume he considered this betrayal. Her father had always blindly trusted Gabriel, believing she was completely under his influence. Alexander didn't answer calls. In a matter of days, he sent his daughter just one text message: "Don't worry about me, I'll manage." Soon after, Anderson, a friend of her father's, called Kathryn. He informed her that her father had had a stroke. Kathryn reached out to Bernard, her now ideal mother-in-law, who lived in a different city, and asked her to stay with them for a while. Bernard had opened his own law firm a few years back and was now spending a lot of time at work, so Calvin would be left without supervision. Kathryn herself took a leave and headed to her hometown. Over the past few years, little had significantly changed in her parents' house. Massive leather armchairs, heavy curtains, an expensive set of natural wood, all of it was built to last for ages, from the time Kathryn still lived there. Even the paintings on the walls, photo frames, and candle holders were the same. These details instantly transported the young woman back to the distant past. She once again caught herself thinking that only her mother could create coziness. Only she had that taste that turned an impersonal house into a warm, familial nest. And as for Gabriel, well, what could be said about her? It was clear right away why she had needed Alexander, so she fled just as easily, without even considering how her own children would live without her. Upon Kathryn's arrival, Anderson took full charge of caring for her father. While Alexander had spent only a brief period in the hospital, his room at home was meticulously arranged for his maximum comfort. In addition, another one of Alexander's friends arranged for a doctor to visit their house a few times a week, and they found a live-in caregiver. Viola, the caregiver, was an experienced and elderly nurse who not only attended to her new charge, but also made an effort to care for the girls, genuinely moved by their mother's story of escape. Entering her father's room, Kathryn found him lying with his eyes open on a specialized bed that could be adjusted using a remote control. However, at the moment, there was no need to change its position. Alexander could take in sustenance and open his eyes, but moving and speaking were no longer possible. Seeing him helpless and emaciated was unbearable. From the doctor, Kathryn learned that her father could hear and even comprehend. She sat down next to him and began to talk about everything that came to mind. Her son Calvin, her husband, her work, her life. Though she still didn't understand how they would move forward, Kathryn knew one thing for certain: she couldn't lose her father. Despite the lack of precise prognoses from the doctors, she was convinced he would recover. Valeria and Elizabeth didn't display much enthusiasm about their older sister's return. Apparently, Gabriel had influenced the girls over the years, nurturing jealousy, which she herself harbored towards Kathryn. You might think that neither she nor the girls were constrained in any way by Alexander, but Gabriel didn't even attempt to hide her displeasure regarding the expenses he incurred on his eldest daughter. On the very first evening when everyone sat down to dinner, Elizabeth and Valeria placed their tablets in front of them, put on headphones, and buried themselves in their screens, chewing and ignoring everyone else. "Girls, how about we don't use tablets during meals?" Kathryn gently made a suggestion. Both sisters raised their eyes simultaneously. "You're not our mom to tell us what to do," Valeria retorted. "Besides, our mom used to say we don't have to listen to you," added Elizabeth. Viola gave Kathryn a knowing look and shrugged. It seemed that in the few days she'd spent at the house, the girls' behavior had become quite predictable. Valeria and Elizabeth were at the same age Kathryn had been when her mother died. It was unlikely they grasped the potential reality of life without Gabriel's return, and that was an eventuality that couldn't be ruled out. Gabriel had been gone for several weeks already. During that time, not a single message had come from her. For a few days, Kathryn met with her childhood friends, strolled through her cherished childhood streets, trying not to dwell on the negative, but she also knew that burying her head in the sand was wrong. She discussed the possibility of having to take her sisters with her husband. Temporarily, perhaps, but potentially even permanently. Bernard didn't oppose this decision, and Kathryn felt an immense sense of relief, thanking him for his understanding. However, before discussing the possibility of Elizabeth and Valeria living with Kathryn, she needed to establish a connection with her sisters. Connecting with Calvin had been straightforward. He was her own son, and Kathryn had an innate, inexplicable bond with him from the moment of his birth. On the other hand, dealing with two spirited girls who clearly struggled with their mother's sudden departure and their father's equally unexpected illness, and who transformed this turmoil into aggression towards their elder sister, Kathryn, was a different challenge altogether. During dinner, Kathryn placed her laptop, which she had brought from home, in front of her, turned up the volume on a recent economic forum video, and started watching it at full blast. "I don't have headphones, so you'll have to bear with it," she told her sisters. The girls ate in silence, exchanging glances. "All right, we get it," Valeria broke the silence. "Watching videos at the table is not the best idea." "Exactly." Kathryn nodded, "but I suggest we quickly finish eating, do the dishes, and then watch something together. By the way, I have a collection of new videos with funny kittens." And she hit the mark. The girls swiftly finished their meal, cleaned up with Viola's help, and settled in front of the laptop. At that moment, Kathryn couldn't likely be amused by the antics of cute kittens. She hardly watched the screen, rather focusing on her sister's reactions. They laughed heartily, drew closer, and Kathryn couldn't help but feel hopeful. The loud laughter was abruptly interrupted by the sound of shattering glass emanating from their father's room. Kathryn, Viola, and the girls immediately rushed to him. Initially, no one understood what had happened, because Alexander's entire face was covered in crimson blotches. The four-stand had fallen over, and the floor was strewn with glass shards from shattered containers and bubbles of medication. Kathryn hurried to her father and carefully began removing the glass fragments from his face. He didn't move, and she couldn't be certain if he felt pain or not. She had read that with partial paralysis, a patient might experience pain but not be able to display their reaction. The thought terrified Kathryn. How on earth did this happen? Viola minted as she gathered the remnants of shattered vials from the floor. How could this four-stand fall so badly, right onto his medication? "Nair, it's really strange," Kathryn agreed. "Maybe Dad twitched somehow and knocked it over. The doctor mentioned that something like that is possible, muscle contractions or something of the sort." "Well, let's hope," the caregiver nodded. "If there are muscle contractions, then our Alexander might recover soon." Kathryn desperately wanted to believe in this. As she tended to her father's face, she pondered how even negative events could carry a glimmer of hope for something better. Elizabeth and Valeria were equally frightened. It was one thing for their father to be lying down, and another to see his broken face and hear the shouts of the adults. They huddled close to Kathryn, embracing her from both sides. "Will our daddy die?" Valeria asked plaintively. "No, of course not," Kathryn reassured her, though she herself wasn't entirely certain. "Let's ask Viola to spend the night in his room," Elizabeth suggested. "What if he accidentally breaks something again? And if Aunt Viola is scared, I can sleep with Dad. I'm not really scared of anything, just a little bit of ghosts. Oh, and the dark, and bugs, too. But other than that, well, there's really nothing I'm scared of." "You know what? Let's chase away all your fears right now," Kathryn suddenly proposed. "Girls, let's draw them on paper, and then tear them into tiny pieces so they won't bother us anymore." The girls enthusiastically embraced Kathryn's idea. They quickly fetched paints, brushes, and, together with their older sister, started drawing scary monsters, ghosts, and huge cockroaches. They then tore everything up together and threw it in the trash. Judging by the content smiles and shining eyes of the sisters, Kathryn understood that she didn't need to worry about their relationship anymore. The next morning, Anderson paid a visit. Despite the considerable weight he had gained over the past 25 years, he hadn't changed much. The same unchanging optimism, signature jokes, and unwavering self-confidence. "How's our patient doing? I bet he skipped his morning jog again today, didn't he?" he joked from the doorway. "And don't even mention it. He just lies there," Viola chimed in. "Shall I make some coffee for you?" "Yes," Anderson grinned. "From your hands, even regular coffee turns into a healing elixir. I'm amazed that Alexander hasn't woken up yet. If a woman like you were taking care of me, I would have woken up from any coma a long time ago." flirting and playful banter with absolutely every woman in sight, regardless of age or lack of romantic intentions, was another of his distinctive traits. Nonetheless, Viola blushed with embarrassment and hurried off to the kitchen to brew coffee. Anderson headed into his friend's room and emerged a few minutes later. Yes, Alexander might not be very talkative, but he listens and doesn't interrupt, he remarked. Priceless qualities, I must say. Kathryn couldn't help but smile. Perhaps that was the right attitude if you can't change the situation. Fretting and dwelling on it is pointless, and humor often saves the day. On the other hand, I can certainly keep up a conversation, Kathryn replied. Coffee's ready. Take a seat at the table. Here's some fresh cookies for you to enjoy, Viola said. Thanks, Anderson replied, settling into a chair and taking a sip of the aromatic beverage. Absolutely delightful. If not for my long-standing marriage to Gloria, the best woman on the planet, I'd marry Viola without a second thought. You've really caught her off guard, Kathryn said. I wish I had your optimism, Cole Anderson. Kathryn sighed sadly. I look at Dad and see no improvement in sight, honestly. Well, you must believe in the best, my girl. Besides, why are you so down? Get yourself together. Your old man is tough as nails. He's got the best treatment, and I won't leave you hanging. You don't need to worry about that. Thank you so much again. Kathryn smiled. I don't even know what I would do without your help. It's all so unexpected. Dad's paralyzed. Gabriel vanished. The girls are alone. Even if I managed to find the finances, I couldn't physically handle taking care of them all. Please understand. Oh, you're being too hard on yourself. Left your husband, your son. Sigh. Anderson shrugged. I told you everything will be okay, Kathryn. But on the other hand, it's actually good that you're here, Anderson agreed, nodding. You see, I'm headed out for a hunting trip with the guys soon, and it's been a real struggle to gather everyone. One's got gout. Another just became a grandparent. The third son is getting married. And the years keep ticking by. It's tough to find people. We've even chartered a helicopter and paid all the fees. Oh, that's quite the grand plan. Kathryn raised an eyebrow. Well, as usual with you. If it's fishing, it's off to Norway. If it's football, you're right there at the Real Madrid vs Barcelona match. You're absolutely right, Kathryn. The more you work, the more you can afford. It's as simple as that, Anderson beamed. So I'll head off, and you take care of the eldest here. I've stocked up on all the medications, paid the doctors. Viola, our wonderful Viola, sent them in advance. Listen, I'll never stop thanking you, Kathryn said, shaking the hand of her father's best friend. Even amidst the uncertainty, things were finally taking shape. Kathryn adjusted herself to the new circumstances, contacted her office, and proposed taking on some remote work, which the company's management was thrilled about. She spent almost the entire next day at the computer, finding familiar satisfaction in being productive again. Engrossed in her work, Kathryn didn't even notice evening settling in. The kitchen was in complete disarray. Bowls, beaters, molds, ingredients, everything was scattered chaotically, and in the midst of the mess stood Elizabeth and Valeria. The girls are in the kitchen making Dad's favorite cupcakes, Viola explained with a smile, noticing Kathryn's surprised expression. Hope we all survive after tasting their culinary masterpieces. Elizabeth's leading the process, so our chances are great, Viola chuckled. Meanwhile, the girls had put the cupcakes in the oven and dashed out into the yard, whispering to each other. So, who's going to clean up after them? The little mistresses, Viola grumbled. We'll be back to clean up. We've got an urgent task. We need to shoot a video and post it before it gets dark. Our subscribers are waiting, Elizabeth replied, shutting the front door behind them. Oh, these girls, always filming something. Well, if they come back and do it, I won't complain, the caretaker shrugged. But I better go finish ironing. I need to change Alexander's bedding today. Still, I should keep an eye on those cupcakes. Kathryn nodded and headed to her room. A few minutes later, the delightful aroma of vanilla wafted through the entire house. Kathryn loved the scent of fresh baking, which always symbolized comfort for her. In the backyard, Valeria and Elizabeth leaned their phone against a tree, dancing and recording the video their audience was eagerly awaiting. Kathryn rejoiced in the carefree, spontaneous nature of her sisters. Suddenly, amidst the inviting aroma, she detected something acrid and heavy. For a moment, she froze. Inhaling deeply, it smelled like gas. Kathryn swung open her door. The odor was stronger in the corridor. She rushed to a window and flung it open. Glancing out at the yard, she confirmed that the girls were still busy filming. Her dad's room was adjacent to the kitchen. This thought propelled Kathryn downstairs at full tilt, skipping steps as she went. She reached her father's door almost simultaneously with Viola, and they entered together. Luckily, Alexander's window was wide open, and the gas smell was nearly imperceptible. He breathed evenly, apparently asleep. "Oh my God, how did this happen?" Viola exclaimed, rushing to the kitchen. Kathryn, reassured by her father's well-being, left the room and shut the door behind her. The gas odor in the kitchen was so overpowering that both of them had to cover their faces with towels. Viola quickly turned off the gas valve, readjusting the stove knobs. "We caught it in time, and it's a good thing I opened the window for Alexander beforehand. He's lying so close to the kitchen. I had a feeling we needed to air the place out, and it came in handy," Viola added with clear relief. Kathryn understood that the open window had been a fortunate coincidence, likely saving her father's life. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was happening in the house that she couldn't quite grasp. Before bedtime, Elizabeth and Valeria asked Kathryn to stay with them in their room. She settled into a chair positioned between their beds. The girls started showing her the videos they had recorded. "This is a trend. Kathryn, do you even know what trends are?" The sisters chimed in excitedly. "Look, this famous blogger is doing a dance, adding music, and then others filmed something similar to that beat. A bit longer, and I might start making these trends myself," she joked in response. Kathryn turned off the lights in the room and settled comfortably. She sat in semi-darkness, singing a lullaby to her sisters as they drifted off to sleep. She extended her hand to each of them, the same hand her mother used to sing to her with when she was a child. Days flew by, and it seemed that her father's condition remained unchanged. Alternating with Viola, they fed him, pureeing his food beforehand to a consistency he could swallow. It was doubtful he understood what he was eating or could chew. He simply swallowed, his eyes closed. The following week, Alexander had another examination scheduled. Kathryn hoped to hear something encouraging from the doctors. In the meantime, she tried to be closer to him, to at least bring some joy to her father's life. She read to him, played his favorite songs, hoping he somehow heard and understood. Viola took on nearly all the household chores by herself. Kathryn handled grocery shopping and all the necessary errands. As she wandered the aisles of a small supermarket with her half-empty cart, she realized there was hardly anything to choose from. Catching sight of a beautiful advertisement banner, she remembered her dad loved red caviar and headed to the seafood section. Along the way, she picked up a few boxes of chocolate candies for the girls and some items from Viola's list. Her heart warmed at the thought of delighting her loved ones with these treats. She thought of her father. His speechlessness and immobility didn't mean he couldn't taste food. His favorite meals could bring him pleasant emotions. Next to the caviar fridge stood a tall, bowed man. He was intently studying the information on one of the glass jars. Kathryn decided to wait, but the man noticed her standing aside and looked at her curiously. "Excuse me, did you happen to go to school 52? The stranger unexpectedly asked, breaking into a smile. Kathryn stared at him, a thought forming almost instantly, sparking like a sudden realization. "Yes. Kathryn, is that you?" the man exclaimed. "I'm Chad. Didn't you recognize me? My grandfather was friends with yours. You've visited our place more than once." "Chad, no way," Kathryn exclaimed, unable to believe her eyes. "You were such a little, scruffy kid." "Well, as you can see, I grew up and lost the mop of hair along the way," Chad chuckled. "What brings you to these spots?" "Just visiting my dad. He's sick." Kathryn sighed sadly. "Otherwise, I live in the capital, been there for many years." Hey, Kathryn, are you in a hurry? How about coffee, maybe catch up? Chad suggested. We haven't seen each other in ages. Let's chat. Chad, I'd love to, she agreed. They left the store and settled into a small cafe across the street. They ordered coffee and strawberry pie. They took turns sharing stories about their classmates and reminiscing about funny incidents from their school days. Kathryn's grandfather, Clifford, was friends with Corey in the army, which led to their families becoming close. When her grandfather passed away, their interactions became less frequent. Corey would occasionally drop by to wish Iris, Kathryn's mom, a happy birthday, always bringing some treat specifically for Kathryn. The last time she saw Corey was at her mother's funeral, and afterward, their connection faded. It seemed then like it was lost forever. Listen, Chad, your grandpa passed away, right? Kathryn cautiously asked. I remember him very well. Yeah, 10 years ago, Chad replied. He was the best grandfather I could have asked for. He was my model of a real man. Whenever I do something, I always think about how he would react to it. Even though he's been gone for so many years, I strive to live in a way that he would be proud of. You have a wonderful family. Truly wonderful, Kathryn nodded. And your parents too. May they stay healthy. And you, I'm sure your grandpa would be proud of you. Yeah, I hope so, Chad agreed. I'm absolutely sure he would. Kathryn said, feeling tears welling up in her eyes. But you've had it tougher than anyone, Kathryn, Chad sighed. Honestly, I didn't want to bring up this topic, but I'm glad things have turned out okay for you, despite such a tragedy. Actually, my mom has been with me all these years, and yes, I talked to her too, Kathryn added. Chad gently touched Kathryn's hand as a sign of support. By the way, all these years, I've had this one scene stuck in my head, my grandpa taking your mom, at night, to the attic at our dacha, Chad mentioned. I happened to be staying there that night and saw it. I asked my grandpa later, and he told me I must have dreamed it. No, that definitely couldn't have happened. Kathryn frowned, finishing her coffee. That moment just stuck in my memory, and for years I kept recalling it, but there was no one to ask. The man answered thoughtfully. And why did it stick? Deborah's birthday was the next day, June 21st. I was so anxious that I didn't sleep all night. Even then, I felt like she would become my future wife. Wait, Kathryn interrupted her former classmate. Your Deborah's birthday is on June 21st. Yay, that's right, Chad nodded. Why do you ask? My mom passed away on June 21st, and her funeral was on the 23rd, she replied somberly. Well, that's what I'm talking about. Your mom, Kathryn, was at our datch the day before her death. Chad summed up, looking thoughtfully at Kathryn. Chad, wait, she whispered. Do you realize what you've just told me? Well, what's the matter? I've been thinking about it for years, and I had no one to discuss it with. We were about 10 years old back then. And let me tell you, I heard your mom crying on the attic. It couldn't have been a dream. Then why didn't you tell me earlier? Kathryn said plaintively. How was I supposed to, Kathryn? Chad shrugged. After Deborah's birthday, we went to Bulgaria with our parents and only came back in August. That's when I found out that your mom had passed away. I was scared to talk to you about it, and later, we moved. You see, my mom disappeared suddenly. Kathryn broke the silence. On June 10th, the morning after I returned from camp, she put me to bed. I woke up, and she was gone. My dad said she was in the hospital, but he refused to take me to her. She was in the hospital for 11 days, and I was never allowed to visit her. Then they said she died from an infection, and supposedly I wasn't allowed to see her because of that, Kathryn continued. Now, looking back, it all seems very strange, Chad. Wait, do you happen to remember how she was dressed back then? I remember by chance. She was wearing a white dress with blue flowers, a beautiful dress, Chad answered. Chad, she whispered, gripping his hand. But that can't be right. Kathryn, calm down. Let's go through this step by step, without hysteria, Chad said, looking into her eyes and gently patting her wrist. On June 11th, you wake up, find out your mom is in the hospital, and you're not allowed to see her. On June 20th, I see her at our house with my grandpa. Yes, she did look very sick. After that, I never saw her again, and on June 21st, she passes away. Overall, despite many questions, the dates do match up. In terms of dates, yes, Kathryn agreed, but the events themselves, if my mom left the hospital, why didn't she call me? And what does your grandpa have to do with any of this? My mind is spinning with the wildest theories, but there couldn't have been any connection between them. Sorry for such a question, Chad. Please don't take it the wrong way, but I just don't know what to think. Kathryn, my grandpa was definitely not like that. He loved my grandma his whole life. They died just a couple of months apart, like swans unable to live without each other. Yes, I remember that, of course. They were always held up as an example for everyone. Well, what could have happened for my mom to end up at your datch? The more mysteries emerged in the story, the stronger the unease grew in Kathryn's chest. Your dad must know something for sure, Chad confidently replied. He must have been the one arranging the funeral, and surely he knew where your mom was all those days. Yes, but now you can't ask him, Chad said, understanding the situation. I'm not sure he even realizes what's happening around him. No reaction to me or the girls. He won't recognize anyone. Yeah, it's all sad. Chad lowered his eyes, feeling awkward. Listen, Chad. Kathryn perked up and once again grabbed her childhood friend's hand. Where is your dacha located? Can we go there, to that attic? My parents sold the dacha about 10 years ago, Chad shrugged. And think about it, Kathryn. It's been 25 years. What could possibly remain there? What clues? I'm sure the new owners must have thrown out all the junk from the attic. Let's still try to go there, please. Kathryn looked at him with pleading eyes. Even if we didn't find anything, it's fine. I won't be able to live peacefully now. Chad looked at his former classmate, realizing he couldn't refuse her. There was too much pain and despair in her eyes. The next morning, Chad and Kathryn headed to the village where the dacha was located. The village was now in disrepair, with crooked houses overgrown with bushes, huge potholes on the paved road, and an eerie, almost graveyard-like silence. Occasionally, locals appeared on the streets, stopping to gaze at the unfamiliar car. Man, Chad sighed, slowly driving the car along the old houses. This place was completely different in our childhood. If only we could find that dacha. I don't remember the turn. Kathryn sat in the front seat, trying not to distract Chad. She didn't know how she would manage to enter a stranger's house, let alone get to the attic. Various thoughts crossed her mind. Maybe she could pose as a journalist or a historian. One version seemed more amusing than the other. After some thought, Kathryn decided to play it by ear. She had an intuitive feeling that her trip to this place wasn't in vain. Finally, the car arrived at a 2-story log cabin. I can't tell if anyone lives there or not. The place looks so run down. Chad squinted, peering into the distance. Actually, look over there. It seems smoke is coming from the chimney. Kathryn said excitedly. Yeah, I see, Chad replied. Chad, you wait for me here. I think if I'm alone, things might go smoother. What if people get scared seeing us? Kathryn got out of the car and walked up to the gate. She tugged on the handle a few times, but the door was locked from the inside. No doorbell, nothing. Kathryn tried to peer inside over the fence, but the shrubs were so dense that she couldn't see anything. Kathryn started knocking louder. After a couple of minutes, the door of the house creaked open, and footsteps could be heard on the premises. A few seconds later, the door was opened by a woman of uncertain age, with disheveled red hair, a flushed face, and yellowish eyes. And you must be Jenny, Daniel's daughter, and he's dozing off, not hearing anything. The hostess opened her arms, relieving Kathryn of the need to come up with a reason for her visit. Please, come in. I'm your stepmother. My name is Jessica. Kathryn followed the woman, entering the garden area. Then they approached the porch. Kathryn cautiously stepped into the house, her steps creaking on the floorboards. The rooms were filled with an unbearable stench, and Kathryn felt a sudden wave of nausea. But there was no turning back now. The chance to enter this house might not present itself again. Dad, wake up. Your daughter is here, Jessica shouted hoarsely somewhere deeper inside the house. Kathryn peered into the room. An elderly man was sprawled on the bed, his arm dangling, and he was snoring loudly, mouth agape. "So, how are you all doing here?" Kathryn whispered, gently playing along with the hostess, trying not to wake up her supposed father. "Everything's great," the hostess replied. Kathryn forced a smile in response, nodding as she looked around. She couldn't fathom how anyone could exist in a living space that resembled more of a junkyard than a home. "And Jessica, well, since Dad's asleep, maybe we shouldn't wake him up. I made sure you're doing well, so now my mind is at ease," Kathryn said sweetly, struggling with her role as Jenny. She was sure that her smile probably looked quite fake from the outside. However, in Jessica's intoxicated state, she likely wouldn't notice anything. "That's right, Jenny. You're such a good girl. But hey, maybe you and I should have a drink." Jessica winked playfully at Kathryn. "No, thank you. I'm the designated driver," the woman politely declined. "I actually need to retrieve something from the attic, some of my old belongings for my daughter's exhibition." "Well, if that's the case, you can go there yourself," Jessica said, pointing to the corridor from which the staircase to the attic ascended. Kathryn gratefully nodded to the woman, silently thanking her lucky stars for the fortuitous turn of events. On the attic, paradoxically, there was much more order than in the main house. It was almost astonishingly tidy, unlike the rest of the dwelling, which had been turned into a mess by the drinking couple. Furthermore, it was clear that this space had remained untouched by the owner's foot for many years. The floor, shelves, and several chairs were covered in a thick layer of dust. After a quick survey, Kathryn sneezed a few times before cautiously moving forward, hunching over and trying not to disturb anything. Children's toys, boxes, books, everything was neatly arranged along the walls, and in the corner there was a folding bed enfolded, with a pillow and a blanket thrown over it. Kathryn felt her legs go weak. Bedding. Why would that be here? But if the folding bed was brought here merely for storage, why bother setting it up, let alone placing bedding on it? Clearly, someone slept here, and it had been a long time. Kathryn could feel her heart pounding anxiously in her chest. She understood, felt in every fiber of her being, that everything was falling into place, and Chad hadn't made anything up. This folding bed had been set up for her mother. Kathryn approached closer and began to lift and shift the objects lying nearby. She paid no attention to the dust and dirt, sensing that she would surely find something very important here. Finally, after pulling out a drawer from a nearby dresser, the woman discovered a yellowed notebook. Between the pages lay a faded, crumpled sheet of paper, her drawing. One of those drawings she used to pass to her mom in the hospital, alongside her dad. Kathryn opened the notebook and couldn't read a word due to the tears that had welled up in her eyes. The lines blurred treacherously, turning into intricate patterns of smudges. Finally, she calmed down a bit, wiped her eyes, and looked closely. Without a doubt, it was her mother's handwriting. Over the years, Kathryn had kept cards and notes from Iris, so she recognized her elaborate, slanted letters among 1,000 others. The woman quickly flipped through the pages, realizing she was holding a diary. Judging by the dates, the entries covered a span of a few months. The last entry was made on June 20th. "Are you coming soon or what?" Kathryn heard a voice from below. Jessica stood under the staircase, trying to peek into the attic. Kathryn realized it was better for her to leave quickly before the actual owner woke up. She slipped the notebook into her bag, grabbed the first book she saw on the shelf, and descended. "Oh, Aunt Jessica, well, if Dad's asleep, that's fine." Kathryn smiled. "I found a book of mine in the attic, so I'll head off now. No time to waste." "Ah, I see." Jessica stretched and gave Kathryn a rather suspicious look. "I thought Daniel mentioned he had a grandson, not a granddaughter." "Oh, well, there is a grandson, the older one, and a granddaughter," Kathryn quickly responded, blushing deeply. "Oh, please tell Dad to cut back on drinking a bit. After all, health isn't infinite. Keep an eye on him here, okay? And take this, buy something delicious, because I didn't even have time to stop by a store on my way." Kathryn pulled out a few bowls from her bag and handed them to Jessica. "But you're such a good girl. We don't need this. We have everything we need," the woman exclaimed, swiftly snatching the money from Kathryn's hand. but I will buy something tasty for Daniel." Kathryn had a hunch that Jessica would buy something tasty for herself and hoped that after a few drinks, she'd forget about the visit of the girl with the beautiful but hard-to-remember name. With these thoughts in mind, Kathryn slipped out of the hallway and quickly headed towards the car, before her supposed father's wife could come up with new suspicions. "Chad, you were right. My mom was actually here. I found a notebook, or rather a diary," the woman said, settling into the car seat. "Let's get out of here as soon as possible." "That's quite something, Kathryn. Just like in the movies," Chad remarked. They left the village and pulled over to the side of the road, near a roadside cafe. Chad suggested getting some takeaway coffee, and Kathryn nodded silently, without looking at the man. With trembling fingers, she opened the notebook and immersed herself in reading. February 25th. Today my world crumbled. There's absolutely no one I can share this with, nor do I want to. All my suspicions turned out to be true, and everything is much worse than I thought. Alexander is having an affair with another woman. I saw them. I overheard their phone conversation. I wish I hadn't heard any of it. He said he's only living with me for the sake of the child, that this is all temporary, and that he's tired of me. And he married me only because my father held a position in the administration and helped him advance. Oh, if only Dad were alive now, he would have dealt with him. But now, there's no one to stand up for me. Alexander was supposed to be my main support and protector all these years. At least that's how it seemed to me. I don't understand how this happened. I look at myself in the mirror. I haven't gained much weight. I try to take care of myself. I love our home. I always strive to create a cozy atmosphere and cook delicious meals. What did I do wrong? They say that in infidelity, both are always to blame. What is my fault? Honestly, I don't know. It's hard to realize that our marriage has come to an end. Even if I wanted to keep the family together, it seems Alexander has different plans. What I regret the most is my Kathryn. Mom taught me to be wise and not to act impulsively. But where do I find that wisdom, and where do I get the strength not to show that I know everything? Kathryn turned the page. The next entry was dated March 3rd. I found out everything about this Gabriel. Observed her. Well, yes, she's beautiful, quite young, but I have serious doubts that her love for Alexander is genuine. Her side of the story is clear. But what is he thinking? Or am I just trying to console myself now? Accidentally ran into Anderson. Confronted him directly. Of course, he knew everything, and he wasn't the only one. Everyone around apparently knew. Alexander has been with Gabriel for a long time. He even introduced her to their common circle of friends, and no one even hinted at it to me. This Gabriel drives around in a brand new car, boasting that her fiancé gave it to her. So, she calls my husband her fiancé, not to mention the fact that he splurged on such an expensive gift for her. Alexander's friend told me he's on my side, that he condemns Alexander and didn't expect this from him. Anderson promised to talk to Alexander, and I think I even overheard their conversation on the phone. Anderson was clearly reprimanding my husband and trying to convince him to save the marriage, but Alexander said horrible things. He lost his temper, raised his voice, and asked Anderson not to interfere in his personal life. Maybe later, he will regret taking that stance. Some little girl has clouded his judgment and suddenly erased everything we've built together for so many years. March 8th. I've never had a Women's Day like this. Alexander left somewhere early in the morning. We coincidentally crossed paths near the supermarket. I cast a glance into the car's interior, and there was a huge bouquet of roses, about 100 of them, no less, arranged in the shape of a heart, white and red. I asked him about the bouquet, and he pushed me so hard that I almost fell, all in front of our child. He told me not to meddle where I shouldn't, that he's taking those flowers to work. Well, I believed him. It's so bitter, so hurtful. After he pushed me so roughly, I don't see the point in being a wise woman, enduring, and waiting for things to get better. I'll tell him everything and file for divorce. The next several pages were missing. The next entry was dated March 15th. These days have been my personal nightmare. I told Alexander that I know everything. At first, he tried to deny it all, then confessed and started blaming me, shouting that I've let myself go, that it's embarrassing to be seen with me in public, that I don't care about myself or him. And then he admitted he married me just for the money. Thank God, Kathryn is at school during the day and doesn't hear our arguments. In the evening, Alexander and I just pretend that everything is fine. He's hardly ever home these days. I look at myself in the mirror and I'm truly frightful. My face has sagged, swollen from tears, and my figure is not in great shape either. He's right. I need to take care of myself, but I have no energy. As soon as things settle down, I'll definitely join a gym. And the worst part is, Alexander won't give me custody of Kathryn. He'll fight for her, and I'll end up paying child support on top of it. I know he can do that. He has connections, money, while I have nothing and no one. I don't feel any love for Alexander. It's so terrifying and strange. Not long ago, this person was the closest to me. But today, I don't feel anything. It's as if everything's been burnt out, and I don't want to continue living. If not for Kathryn. March 29th. I had a terrible dream last night. It felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, a chasm below, many people around me, familiar faces, and suddenly the ground beneath me began to crumble. I reached out to all those people, but no one wanted to support me. I was falling down. I only have one way out, to become stronger and not break. April 17th. 2 weeks ago, I filed for divorce. It turned out to be quite simple. Yesterday, we both had to appear in court, but Alexander flew out on business. His lawyer came instead. The hearing was postponed. I think he's deliberately stalling. At work, our manager, Donald, is supporting me. He got divorced last year, went through all of this. He shared a lot of interesting and dreadful things. They're still dividing property with his ex-wife, but at least they don't have children. I know Alexander will do everything to avoid sharing any assets, especially since the house was bought before our marriage. But I don't care about that now. The main thing is to prevent him from taking Kathryn. That's what he constantly threatens me with, and I haven't figured out what to do yet. I'm more than certain he doesn't care about the child. He's just being malicious. And in general, a normal father should understand that a girl needs her mother. Why is Alexander's mind currently functioning in only one direction? With each paycheck, I save a small sum to rent an apartment later on. In principle, I already have enough money. So, I'll start searching now. Am I scared? Very scared. Can I handle this alone? I'm worried about Kathryn. I hinted to her that soon her father and I won't be living together. She cried so much yesterday. Yes, she said she'd live with me in that case, but she loves her daddy very much and doesn't want us to separate. She's begging us not to do it. My heart is breaking. But there's something good after all. We're spending more time with Donald. At first, we went to lunch together. Then he gave me a ride home a few times. And next week, him, me, Diana, and Elliot from the project department are going on a business trip to another city. I'm looking forward to this trip more than a vacation. I want a change of scenery. I won't lie to myself. I enjoy being around Donald. Of course, there's a slight flirtation between us. Nothing major. I feel like we've known each other for 1,000 years. I say a word. He continues the sentence. I just think, and he says my thoughts out loud. Word for word. We have similar views, tastes. Can that really happen? Just 6 months ago, I wouldn't have allowed myself to get so close to a colleague. All these years of my married life, I was afraid to even talk unnecessarily with a man. But now I feel free and truly glad that there's someone I can trust by my side. Kathryn turned the page thoughtfully. May 15th. The business trip was like a breath of fresh air. All our free time was spent together with Donald. Diana and Elliot, our colleagues, seemed to be in a romantic relationship, so they occasionally made jokes about us and were clearly pleased that we were constantly going somewhere together. I'm remembering it now, smiling, and feeling that shiver through my body when he touched me, as if accidentally. God, thank you for these emotions. Thank you for letting me feel happy and carefree, even if just for a few days. I really didn't want to leave and say goodbye to Donald. Breathing is easier when he's around. But at least I gained the strength to move forward and address the divorce matters. May 30th. Our divorce was finalized, as if a burden was lifted off my shoulders. Strangely, there's no anxiety or tears. Yes, it's very disappointing that my family life didn't work out. I'm scared if I can manage on my own. Yes, I'm scared. Alexander is on a business trip, and I'm really glad about that. I have the opportunity to pack my things calmly without feeling his malicious gaze on me. In a few days, I'll rent an apartment and Kathryn and I will move there. Then we'll have to decide on her place of residence. I haven't told her anything yet. I can't imagine how she'll handle this news. But still, I need to wait for Alexander to tell Kathryn together. Oh Lord, give me the strength to endure this nightmare amidst all these negative emotions. I forgot to mention how close Donald and I have become. Yesterday, we spent the night together for the first time. It's almost scary to write about how magical it was. No one has ever said such pleasant things to me in my entire life. I don't know what will happen with Donald in the future. It's too soon to talk about serious relationships. Maybe that's how it should be. Just go with the flow and move forward. But together this time, I'm happy that during the toughest period of my life, fate gave me a man who looks at me with loving eyes, helps, supports, and plans for the future. The next entry in the diary was dated June 2nd. Today, I spent the first night in the new apartment, or rather, Donald and I did. Half of the things I need aren't here. My stuff is still in boxes. We slept on the floor, but it didn't matter at all. The important thing is that he's here, and soon Kathryn will be back from camp, and she'll live with us. It was so nice to cook breakfast for Donald. Alexander never appreciated it and always took it for granted. He would just nod when I asked if it was good. In a week, Kathryn returns from camp. On that day, I'll be staying at my ex-husband's house. I've decided that when my daughter returns, her mother should be in her familiar place. Then we'll explain everything to her, pack her things, and move here. The apartment itself is very cozy, and it's a good neighborhood. The area is gated, there's a playground, and the school isn't far. Donald said he'll cover the rent himself, but I really hope he'll move here too. Honestly, I don't want to be apart from him, even for a short time. I never thought I would fall in love at this age, like a schoolgirl, really. I noticed his looks before, and I always liked him. He even inspired admiration, smart, handsome, promising. Well, what more could you wish for? And this dream of mine has become my reality. I went to Alexander's to collect some things from the office, but he had locked it. So, I'm sitting here, waiting for my ex-husband to open the door to the house that was mine not too long ago. Thank goodness he hasn't changed the locks inside the house yet. While I wait, I decided to make an entry in the diary. Lately, it's been really helping me. You write everything down, put it in order, and suddenly it becomes much easier. I feel trapped here. There's a woman's robe hanging in the bathroom. Apparently, that's where Gabriel sleeps. Though, why am I even thinking about this? Now Alexander is free as well. Maybe he'll bring a new girl home every day. That's not the worst part. Alexander found out about Donald and me. He saw us recently. From the moment he entered, he started asking questions, and I didn't hide it. Let him know. Let him know that I'm not alone now, and there's someone to protect me. Donald always offers to come here with me, afraid that my ex-husband might act aggressively. But I know Alexander. He's not like that. He'll never raise a hand to a woman. He doesn't need to. He can crush anyone psychologically. If hell on earth exists, then I'm currently in it. What happened in the past few days is simply inconceivable, monstrous. My brain still refuses to believe that this really happened. I'll try to describe the chronology of events. On that Saturday when Kathryn arrived, I was sitting in her room. Donald called me, said he had something to talk to me about. I went out. I got into his car. He seemed troubled about something. We drove away from the house. He was silent, and I started to get worried. I asked him to stop at a convenience store on the highway to buy some water. I got out of the car, and then an explosion went off. I fell. The store's windows shattered, and I was hit by fragments. When I got up, I realized what had happened. Donald's car had exploded. He was inside. After that, my memory is blurry. It seems I lost consciousness. I only remember sirens, a lot of people running around and bustling. Then I woke up in the hospital. I had scratches on my face, and I was sobbing uncontrollably from shock. They injected something into me, and I blacked out again. In the evening, the police arrived. They arrested me, took me to the station, and informed me that preliminary examination revealed that the explosive device was in my bag, which I had left on the back seat of the car. I was charged with Donald's murder. They said I might face a serious charge, but they didn't listen to me, just took me to a cell. And then Alexander came. We spoke through the bars. He said that I would go to prison and that he would personally ensure that I got a life sentence. It's hard to believe what's happening. It's a nightmare, and I'm trapped in a web of accusations and despair. How could my life take such a horrifying turn? I need to find a way to prove my innocence and unravel this twisted tale. I can't give up. I won't let this false accusation define my life. I have to fight for justice and for Kathryn's future. My daughter needs me now more than ever, and I won't let her down. But the road ahead is daunting, and the truth seems so distant and unattainable. If I ever try to contact Kathryn, no matter where I am, he will destroy me and tell her that I'm dead. Before Alexander left, he gave me a drawing from Kathryn, and then I don't remember anything again. For several days, I was in a daze, lying on a bench in jail. I didn't understand what was happening. They took me in for interrogations, asked me to sign things. I don't remember what I said or did. I remember not eating anything during those days, and I started running a fever. My strength was dwindling each day, and then they came for me, brought me to the hospital. Yesterday, General Corey, my dad's friend from the army, came there. I had seen him last at the funeral and a few times after that for birthday wishes. Well, he said he heard about my situation and will try to help. In the morning, Corey came again and said he arranged for me to be released on a non-departure pledge. He took me back to my apartment, and in the evening, he came again with bad news. According to all the documents and examinations, it seems that I placed the bag in the car and deliberately walked away before the explosion. They even found a witness who allegedly saw me running away from the car, although in reality, I was calmly walking towards the store. I suspect Alexander might have orchestrated all of this. He solved all the problems at once. I'm not there, Kathryn is with him, and Donald is gone too. I still can't wrap my head around what happened. Can my ex-husband really be capable of this? And also, I don't understand how all of that could have ended up in my bag. When I left, I clearly checked it. If there was something foreign inside, I would have noticed. Right now, I can't think or draw any conclusions. I've only managed to find the strength to write all this down. I hoped that putting it into words would make it even a bit easier, but it's not. The thought that I'll never see Kathryn again and that Donald is gone makes me want to see them. I don't see the point in continuing to live. To spend the rest of my days in prison and emotional agony. I don't want that. Kathryn closed her eyes. Each new entry was heavier than the last. How did Mom survive all of this? And Dad, could he really be behind all this? Kathryn turned the page. I'm sitting in the attic at the summer house, Iris wrote. 100 kilometers away from the city. I'm still in the same dress I left home in that night. Corey brought me here. He said there's no chance of resolving my case. Serious people are behind him. Corey didn't say it directly, but he hinted that my ex-husband is involved in this. Corey suggested that I escape to another country. The trial is in a few days, and after that, I most likely won't be set free. So, I have a few days to leave before I'm declared a fugitive. Corey assured me that he planned everything in advance. When I asked him why he's doing all this, knowing that he's putting himself in danger too, he answered that once my dad saved his life during the war, pulling him out of captivity, risking his own life. Even though he could have easily escaped alone, he carried him, wounded, several kilometers, and now, he can't let a girl be thrown into prison. So at least I'll have a chance in another country. He asked me not to take anything with me, no belongings, and under no circumstances attempt to contact my daughter or anyone else. At least not in the near future, until he figures out a way to resolve my situation. So, I'll leave this diary here. Maybe someone will read it later and learn about the monstrous injustice that forced me to run. I have no more strength, No more emotions. My heart has been torn out of my chest and shattered into pieces, like Donald's car, my beloved Donald, with whom I was happy. Only an infinite love for my daughter remains within me, in every cell of my body. Only she gives me the strength to move forward and hope that I'll ever see my Kathryn. When Kathryn finished reading, her whole body was shaking with a fine tremor. She struggled to take a few sips of the hot coffee Chad brought her and handed him the notebook. He quickly read those few pages and looked back at his former classmate with a puzzled expression. "I didn't understand," the man murmured. "Does this mean your mom is alive?" "I'm afraid to think about it," Kathryn whispered through her tears. "I'm afraid that I'll believe it now and then find out something different." "Kathryn, gather yourself. We're not in a Hollywood blockbuster. Pull yourself together. Use your head." He spoke calmly, trying to restore composure to his friend with his voice. "Right now, I'm going to ask you a very important question, Kathryn. I apologize in advance, but this could clarify so much." "Go ahead, I'm ready," Kathryn said, freezing in anticipation. "Tell me, did you see your mom in the casket? Did you see them lower her into the ground?" he asked, observing Kathryn's reaction. For a few seconds, she stayed silent, her eyes widening. "The casket was closed, Chad. It was closed." Kathryn struggled to get the words out. "Yes, I didn't ask. I was afraid. I really wanted to remember my mom alive and beautiful." "All right, now let's follow the path of my thoughts, please," Chad said. "Are you trying to say she wasn't there?" "Oh my God, Kathryn. If that's the case, I'll be thanking the heavens for the rest of my life." Kathryn covered her face with her hands, trying to contain her emotions. "But then where is my mom? According to this diary, your grandfather helped her leave the country. Let's assume that's true. But over all these years, she could have returned or found a way to contact me." "Kathryn, listen, right now, here, we can only make senseless guesses. Understand that. You're Bernard. He's a lawyer, after all, Kathryn. He must know someone in the authorities. Call him, tell him everything. He'll advise you on what to do. After all, there's a way to arrange an exhumation. Find out who's buried there, where you've been leaving flowers for 25 years. Returning home, Kathryn quickly went into her room, ignoring the surprised looks from Viola and the kids. What she had learned was so overwhelming that she needed a moment to catch her breath and be alone with her thoughts. All her life, Kathryn had felt her mother's presence. Throughout the years, she had mentally conversed with her, sometimes even speaking aloud. She had written letters that had nowhere to be sent. However, visiting the cemetery wasn't something she liked. In fact, she felt a certain relief in living far away and not having to visit that place often. But she couldn't completely avoid it. It was the accepted norm. Kathryn had often heard that many people were drawn to the place where their loved ones were buried, but in her case, it was quite the opposite. When she visited her mother's grave and brought her flowers, Kathryn felt emptiness and a deafening void. Gathering her thoughts, she called her husband and explained everything to him, trying to be as convincing as possible. Contrary to her doubts, Bernard took this story very seriously. "Kathryn, I'm wrapping up my current cases with my partner, and I'll be flying out to you this evening," he replied. How lucky Kathryn was to have such a husband. She felt it acutely, especially in the most critical moments of her life. Bernard took on responsibility, solved any of her problems to the best of his ability, and if it was impossible, he provided her with the support that made wings grow. Kathryn realized that if she started overthinking, speculating, and assuming now, it would only make things worse. So many questions swirled in her mind. Was her mother alive? Could they manage an exhumation? And if her mother was alive, where was she? And why hadn't she reached out all these years? This was why she needed to wait for Bernard, her husband, to begin unraveling this situation. Nevertheless, emotions overtook her, burned from the inside with corrosive streams, preventing her thoughts from calming down. Could Kathryn's father be capable of such a thing? Yes, he had always been authoritative and tough. In Kathryn's childhood, she got scared when she heard him talk to his subordinates. Later, as a teenager, she often caught snippets of conversations that terrified her. The times were tough and turbulent, and occasionally intimidating-looking men in black leather jackets would appear in the house. They would immediately head to her dad's office, tightly closing the doors behind them. Kathryn didn't know what they discussed or what other matters her father dealt with beyond his main job. And now, all these childhood memories took on an entirely new meaning. Now Kathryn understood that her father was probably somehow connected to criminal activities. Thus, her mother's version didn't seem as absurd to her anymore. Towards Kathryn, her father displayed only toughness. In some cases, pressure. After her mother's departure, the art school was abandoned. Her father frequently claimed that such dabbling could be pursued merely for enjoyment, and that it wasn't necessary to spend so much time on lessons. The girl couldn't contradict her father, and for a long time, she didn't touch an album or paint, convincing herself that her father knew best. He surrounded his only daughter with support, care, and love. He just didn't love her mother, and he had become associated with Gabriel long before her disappearance. But was he capable of such a dreadful act? Kathryn didn't have an answer to that question. She entered her father's room. Alexander lay with his eyes closed, breathing evenly. She couldn't tell whether he was sleeping or not. All these days, Kathryn had felt like he could hear her. At least, that's what she wanted to believe. After all, her father could open and close his eyelids, chew, swallow. So why couldn't he hear and feel? "What happened to you, Daddy?" she whispered. "You couldn't have done something like that to Mom. You're a different kind of dad to me. Even if you hated her, you loved me and could have guessed how hard it would be for me without Mom." She studied her father's face, trying to discern any emotions. Similar scenes often appeared in movies. A character would say something to a paralyzed person, and a tear would roll down their cheek. A cliched script maneuver that tugged at the viewer's heartstrings. Kathryn would give a lot right now to see even slight signs in her father that his heart was feeling, instead of the death abyss of silence. Summoning her strength, Kathryn entered her girls' room and wished them good night. Elizabeth and Valeria rejoiced and immediately started hugging their sister. In this chain of tragic events, there was one silver lining: the girls, to whom Kathryn grew more attached with each passing day. Who would have thought that life would bring her closer to her half-sisters in such an intricate way? Kathryn understood the hardship her sisters were going through without their mother, even though they knew she was alive and well. That feeling when the person closest to you abandons you, even someone as misguided as Gabriel, hurt worse than any weapon. Kathryn knew she couldn't leave her sisters if her father didn't recover, but she couldn't let them experience the same feelings of emptiness and worthlessness that she herself had encountered. In the hallway, she crossed paths with Viola. "Are you heading to bed, Kathryn?" she kindly inquired. "Yes, probably. I'll take a bath and then lie down. It's been a heavy day. I'm tired," Kathryn replied to the woman. "Well then, I'll finish up Alexander's evening routine now and head to bed as well. Sweet dreams." The caretaker smiled, gently patting Kathryn's shoulder. Such a simple, almost motherly gesture. Even these small things warmed Kathryn's heart. There had been far too few of them in her life. Kathryn turned on the tap, filled the bathtub with warm water, adding pine-scented bath salts, and sank into the comfort with pleasure. Just what she needed. The water effortlessly washed away the fatigue and tension accumulated throughout the day. Kathryn sighed, closing her eyes. How difficult it was to halt this stream of thoughts. Now everything looked different to her. She mentally replayed her past, trying to find some kind of foothold. Could her mother have still appeared in her life? After all, she often saw glimpses of her in crowds. And once, during a school event when her class was putting on a play, Kathryn distinctly saw her mother in the audience. She had rushed into the audience, ignoring the outcry of her teacher. It turned out to be a woman who resembled Iris but was a complete stranger. But the pain and disappointment Kathryn felt at that moment stayed with her for many years. Now, she increasingly wanted to unearth the truth, no matter how bitter it might be. Once again, a fleeting thought crossed Kathryn's mind that something important was eluding her. A weak hunch flickered for a split second in her consciousness and then vanished, like a fleeting ray of sunlight. For several days now, Kathryn had been vainly attempting to catch hold of it. But each time, her thoughts swerved in a different direction. Too many events had occurred in such a short span of time. Today's detective work with the investigation and the discovery in the attic was quite something. And in her father's house, there was always some turmoil. The girls would get hurt, then have a quarrel, and that gas incident was a whole other story. And at this moment, it struck Kathryn gas. It was on that evening that the thought form lodged in her mind, refusing to let her rest for several days now. Kathryn leapt out of the water, hastily dried herself with a towel, and grabbed her smartphone from the bedside table. There it was, the video she received from the girl that evening. Elizabeth and Valeria were dancing in the backyard. Before, Kathryn had only been watching them, ignoring everything else. In the background, a bathroom window with a light on was clearly visible, and Viola was arranging the bedding. On the left, her father's room window was tightly shut. At some point, it swung open abruptly, as if on its own. Kathryn attempted to zoom in on the video. It seemed like some silhouette appeared in the window, but the details were too vague to make out. One thing was clear: the caregiver was in another room at that moment. Kathryn sat on the edge of the tub, trying to piece the facts together. She vividly remembered Viola telling her that she had opened the window herself, but the video showed something entirely different. The window had been opened from the inside by someone else. There was only one person who could have done that: her father. Now, events were taking a completely different turn. Some answers were already becoming obvious. She just needed to find the evidence to confirm them. Kathryn stepped out of the water, put on a terry cloth robe, and returned to her room. Sniffing out the light, she lay in bed, realizing she wouldn't be able to fall asleep tonight. She felt the urge to burst into her father's room right now and start shaking him, grabbing his arm and shouting. If he wasn't actually sick and had been pretending to be paralyzed all this time, he probably wouldn't withstand such an unexpected attack. However, Kathryn considered the possibility that all of this was just a product of her overactive imagination. In that case, she would look utterly foolish. Besides, her father could play his role brilliantly, and then she wouldn't be able to find out anything. The house was so quiet that she could hear the ticking of the wall clock downstairs and the monotonous chirping of crickets outside. Suddenly, from somewhere deep within the house, she heard a faint male voice. Initially, Kathryn thought someone was watching TV in the living room, although it was unlikely considering the clock's hands had long crossed midnight. Yes, Alexander's composure was something to envy. He probably wasn't prepared for this turn of events, yet he continued to brilliantly play his role. "You probably have an idea of how many questions I have for you," Kathryn said in a trembling voice, "but right now, I'm scared. You've always been my main protection and support. Yet, it turns out I hardly know you. I'm afraid to hear the truth." "Wait before jumping to conclusions. Come here, sit down," her father instructed. "Dad, I found Mom's diary. She described events in the last months before she disappeared. So, just answer me the main question. Is Mom alive? I'm telling you, go into the room, close the door and sit down," Alexander sternly ordered. This was his usual way of communicating in situations where someone even slightly challenged him. But this time the situation was different, and Kathryn had no intention of becoming a submissive sheep. Taking a deep breath, she summoned her courage to stand up to her father. Yet, just at that moment, a knock sounded at the door. Her father jumped up, grabbed Kathryn's hand, and pulled her deeper into the room. "Listen to me. This is very serious. Kathryn, no matter who it is, say nothing about me getting up," he whispered loudly in her ear, gripping her shoulders tightly. "It's better not to let anyone in without the proper authorization, even if it's the police. You have the right to do that." Kathryn stared at her father in silence, finding it hard to believe that all of this was happening to them. Her world had turned upside down, and everything she held onto for the past few years had suddenly crumbled. Quickly descending the stairs, Kathryn peeked through the peephole and let out a relieved sigh upon seeing Bernard outside. "Darling, I probably woke you up," he said softly, embracing his wife. "I called you a few times to let you know I landed, but you didn't answer." "Bernard, you came just in time. Something is happening here," Kathryn held her husband so tightly that she could feel his heart pounding. Dad, as it turns out, isn't sick, and he hasn't explained anything yet. I'm very scared. But now I'm here, and you don't have to be afraid of anything anymore. We'll figure this out together, Bernard comforted as he stroked his wife's hair, sensing her trembling subside. After your call, I immediately had my people look into things. There are already some results, Kathryn, and the most important news, your mom is alive. Upon hearing those words, Kathryn realized that everything else hardly mattered. Worries, suspicions, anger, and resentments, all of it instantly faded and lost its significance. With Bernard by her side, she walked into her father's room. He was already dressed and unusually alert, sitting in a chair and smoking. Upon seeing his son-in-law, Alexander extinguished his cigarette, stood up, and extended his hand. Bernard gave it a dry shake. Dad, we're both listening to you very carefully, Kathryn urged him. Just tell everything, from start to finish. Lying and making up stories are pointless now. I read about your divorce and Donald in Mom's diary. I'm deeply sorry to you, Kathryn, and of course to Iris as well, but most of all to you, Alexander began. I'm not going to pretend that I'm not involved at all. Yes, I'm guilty, but I have no connection to Donald's death, and I certainly didn't plan to take revenge on your mother. Well, let's assume that's the case. Then how can you explain everything that happened? It was all orchestrated by Anderson, my once best friend, Alexander replied in a low voice. Kathryn's eyes widened, and she turned her gaze to Bernard. He nodded in agreement, confirming her father-in-law's words, which came as a complete surprise. Bernard, so you knew about this too? Kathryn exclaimed. Yeah, I didn't even have time to say anything from the moment I walked in, but let Alexander explain himself. I'll correlate all of this with the information I have, Bernard responded. After a brief pause, her father began his account. My main mistake was marrying Iris without love. Yes, I understand how difficult this is for you to hear right now, Kathryn, but since we're speaking the truth here, she was good, very beautiful, fell for me right away. We dated, things were okay, but there were no sparks, no connection. Nonetheless, we started a relationship, and then she got pregnant. Her father, Clifford, nearly pummeled me. Kathryn, do you remember your grandfather? He called me in for a talk, said I had to marry her. I was young, a complete fool. I wasn't even scared. I just caved in. Didn't you have even a bit of love for Mom? Kathryn asked, looking at her father with a probing gaze. But, to some extent, I did love her, of course. I didn't deserve a woman like her. Her father tried to justify himself, but it turned out the way it did. My new father-in-law promised me a lot in terms of my career. It all started happening quickly. I clearly didn't measure up to their family's level. They needed a worthy son-in-law, someone fitting. That's where the position came from, in the business. Of course, I didn't sit idle by. They gave, and I made the most of it. I made sure not to disappoint Clifford. All right, let's get to the point, Kathryn said grimly. Well, then you were born. I realized that you were now the most important person to me, the purpose of my life, Alexander continued. For your sake, I tried to make Iris happy. That's how we lived for about 8 or maybe 9 years, but none of it worked out. She remained a stranger to me. Fights began, irritation built up, and I started getting involved with other women, and then I met Gabriel. That's when I lost my mind. But divorcing wasn't my plan. I only wanted to keep the marriage intact for you, Kathryn. Not the most righteous motive. A marriage for the sake of marriage. You can't maintain a family solely for the kids. They sense the insincerity, and they're unlikely to thank you for such a sacrifice, Kathryn said. Yes, I agree. Back then, I didn't understand. Her father shrugged, and it would have been fine. But your mother found out about everything. She decided to file for a divorce. By that time, Clifford was no longer alive, but he managed to set things up in such a way that in the event of a divorce, I would lose everything. Even from up there, he looked after his daughter. Iris didn't know about this. On the contrary, she was worried that she'd be left with nothing. I orchestrated all the conversations so that she believed I had power, connections, but in reality, I had nothing. As for the administrative position, maybe they wouldn't have kicked me out. But as for the business, it was hopeless. And we were running the business together with Anderson. So in the case of my divorce, he'd lose everything as well. So that's why Mom wrote that Anderson was on her side. Kathryn mused. But in reality, he couldn't have cared less about Mom. He was only thinking about himself. Yes, that's how it was. Alexander nodded. But I didn't even imagine he would go to such lengths for money. I shared with him that Iris was divorcing me, that she had someone else. I expressed my strong feelings against her and against that Donald. And Anderson realized that if Iris divorced me, she would take the business, all the assets, and the child with her. But in case of her death, everything would stay with me, like a direct heir. So, naturally, Anderson had nothing to lose from this plan. For him, the outcome was clear. The moral aspect didn't matter to him. So, you're saying you weren't involved in his plans? Bernard asked suspiciously. No, of course not, Alexander exclaimed. Yes, I was cruel and unfair to Iris, but she was the mother of my child, and that was crucial. Yes, I vocalized my thoughts to Anderson about how if Iris left, I'd lose everything. I tried to prevent the divorce in some way, but I could only delay it. And at some point, Anderson cornered me, saying everything would be fine. I didn't really think deeply about the situation then. There was so much going on: trips, contracts, and Gabriel again. So, the topic of divorce just slipped away. And how could I have foreseen how far Anderson would go? And how did he orchestrate all of this? Kathryn asked in a hushed voice. Well, he didn't do it with his own hands, her father replied thoughtfully. He had a whole group of people who handled any kind of issue. Let's put it this way, outside the legal field. They helped us more than once, of course, without getting involved in any criminal activities. Although everyone understood they were capable of anything. Iris's bag was empty, but with Donald's car, it was preplanted, and then they coordinated with the experts. According to the paperwork, the explosive substance supposedly ended up in Iris's bag, and the witness was also a decoy. Everything was supposed to point to Iris, so that the circle would be complete. So, you knew everything, and all these years you continued to be friends with him. You're just as much of a criminal, Dad. Kathryn exclaimed. Who told you, kiddo, that I continued being friends with him? Alexander retorted. Think back. How often did he appear around us later on? Yes, for a while. We continued running the business together, and then we split. You have to understand, we were in the same boat. I couldn't betray him. He would have pulled me down with him immediately. Iris's case was fabricated in a way that no one would dig deeper. Everything pointed to her, and when Corey got involved, we had to slightly overplay things and stage the funeral. At that time, doing this was a piece of cake. It was a relief for me to know that Iris had been taken abroad. I knew they had done something to ensure she wouldn't attempt to return or contact anyone. Her father fell silent. Kathryn's thoughts raced in her head, and she could finally see the whole picture clearly. It was as if she had cleaned a dirty window and could finally see the whole street. I'm fitting all of this into my head. Dad, you're a monster. Everyone involved in this, you're not human. Kathryn couldn't hold back her tears anymore. I know, sweetheart, and there's no forgiveness, Alexander whispered. Life punishes me slowly. Do you think there was a reason for that stroke theater? Somehow, the story started to surface. Anderson found out first and quickly moved to make me the scapegoat. We had to fake the illness to buy time, to prepare the groundwork for further actions. For the sake of certainty, Viola was brought in, and she was paid well. Do you think he visited here, pretending to check up on me, just to threaten me and inform about what we'd be doing next? The story began to surface because after so many years, Iris still managed to find people willing to help her in this matter. Alexander continued, interrupted by Bernard. He turned his gaze to his wife, who was wide-eyed, trying not to miss a single word. For many years, she was practically tied hand and foot, settling in a new country, battling depression. She truly couldn't reach out or come back. Bernard, where is she now? How is she living? What happened to her? Kathryn bombarded her husband with questions. calm down. We'll talk about this now, just the two of us, for her safety. I can't even tell you which country Iris is in right now," her husband reassured her. "It's a shame that all this information reached us only now. As you can see, it took less than a day to find out so much. Nowadays, people leave a digital trail everywhere, and if someone really needs to, their every move can be traced within hours. But, since you've become so involved in the story, Alexander, why don't you share what the next steps are?" Bernard asked with a hint of sarcasm. "Anderson is already being monitored. Of course, he didn't go hunting. His car location is being determined," Bernard confidently replied. "I don't know how you managed to live all these years so calmly." Kathryn turned to her father with anger and pain in her voice. "You got married, had children. How could you look me in the eyes when I cried all day long after the funerals? You saw how much I missed Mom and that I never came to terms with her loss. There wasn't a single day I didn't think about her. You took my mother away from me. Life is never just black and white, Kathryn. Even the best person, under certain circumstances, can act like an animal." Alexander spoke slowly, carefully choosing his words. "Was I bad? Yes. Was I good? Also yes. But I disagree, Dad." Kathryn said, "Yes, we all make different choices, but there are certain moral boundaries that many people never cross." "Well, then there haven't been circumstances in people's lives that forced them to cross that line," her father insisted. "Dad, you're trying to justify yourself, and it sounds absurd. These weren't even close to the circumstances that would warrant such monstrous actions, let alone allowing them to happen." Kathryn stood up from her seat. "Yes, I believe you weren't directly involved in the murder, but you allowed all of this to happen. If it weren't for you, none of this would have occurred. What else could I have done when it had already happened?" Alexander looked up at his daughter with eyes that were heavy and pained. Their gazes locked, and he held on to that connection as if it were a lifeline. The man's lips quivered. Kathryn's heart sank. This was her father, once strong, brave, and kind. How pitiful he looked now. "Kathryn, there was no turning back at that point. Regarding the death of that young man, Donald, I wasn't upset. I won't hide it," the man continued. "But Iris was still alive. You could have at least hinted to me that Mom was alive. I was so little. You could have come up with any story, even the most fantastical one. I would have believed it and kept that secret." Kathryn's voice grew louder. "You were, and still are, selfish. You got rid of your wife, as if you emerged from all this unscathed, with clean hands." "What about me?" Alexander retorted. "Didn't I think about you all these years? I did everything for you, Kathryn." Alexander's self-control wavered. "Everything was at your feet. Even when Elizabeth and Valeria were born, I didn't deprive you of anything. Solved any problem you had, provided for you while you were studying, bought you a car, an apartment. Many people can't save up for a home throughout their entire lives, Kathryn." "Yes, Dad, I'm infinitely grateful for all that, but do you even realize what it's like to be without a mother at 10 years old? No, Dad, you can't even imagine the extent of that pain. No apartments or cars can replace a mother," Kathryn said. "So, you're saying now that everything I did was pointless? Oh, thank you so much, dear daughter. My deepest gratitude to you," her father muttered sarcastically. He instantly deflated, turned away, and sat on the bed, burying his head in his hands. Kathryn's breathing was heavy as she looked past him. She felt guilty. It seemed that her father wasn't playing a role. She had never seen him like this before. Suddenly, Alexander lifted his pale face to her, gave a crooked smile, and slowly slid from the bed to the floor. "And for half an hour, I've been trying to understand your father's medical history. There are a lot of questions." The doctor looked at Kathryn with suspicion, flipping through papers. Recovery, another stroke, all in such a short time span. And it seemed the therapy was perfectly chosen, and he was under observation, based on your information. Of course, there are many questions, Kathryn thought. First, the fabricated stroke, and now a real one. I, even more so, don't understand any of this, doctor. Besides, I wasn't with him when this happened the first time. Kathryn said aloud. Just tell me how it is. What are the prognoses? What's next? In the case of a hemorrhagic stroke, making precise predictions isn't possible. In the coming days, your father will be in the intensive care unit, under 24/7 observation. After that, we'll conduct further examinations to get a clear picture. I can tell you only one thing: a fairly extensive area of the brain has been affected. Complete restoration of speech is unlikely. When Bernard brought Kathryn home, she had only one desire: to collapse onto the bed and sleep for a whole day. Or even better, too, her body refused to function any further. It seemed like hallucinations were starting to set in for Kathryn. "Kathryn, our mother has arrived," the girls shouted in unison as soon as they saw their sister. Gabriel, dressed strangely, sat on the couch in a lotus position, a blissful smile on her face as she looked at them. "Hello, Kathryn," she said, "and hello, Bernard. Thank you for being with my loved ones during these difficult days." "Hello, Gabriel." Kathryn managed a tired smile. "I'm so glad you're here. The girls have missed you a lot, and we have some challenging days ahead. Let's get some fresh air into the room." "But what's this? Does the smell bother you?" Gabriel looked surprised. "These are healing Indian incenses. I lit them to cleanse the house of negativity." "Kathryn, I've already cleaned the house of negativity a bit, just without incense, with a vacuum cleaner and a cloth," Viola interjected, "and I've prepared dinner, so let's gather at the table." Kathryn scrutinized the caregiver. She had quite a few questions for her. It was clear that the woman was genuinely concerned and trying to please. "Viola, I'd only have some tea, but I'm sure Bernard and the kids are hungry. And you, Gabriel, do you eat regular food?" Kathryn said in a sarcastic tone. "Oh, Kathryn, how rude." Gabriel grimaced. "You could use a pilgrimage to India as well. After a few months, you start to see the world from the perspective of goodness." "I hope your perspective of goodness extends to your husband, whom you'll have to take care of now," Kathryn replied calmly. "You could have at least gone to the hospital to visit him instead of fumigating the house with incense." "Kathryn, leave the negativity outside our home," Gabriel persisted. "Of course, although I don't see the point. If a person isn't in this reality, I will do much more for him. I'll practice healing meditation and send him energy impulses for recovery." "Well, all of this is certainly interesting," Bernard interrupted her, "but impulses don't eliminate the need for physical care for Alexander." "Well, there are specially trained people for that," Gabriel retorted. "Are you suggesting I should be changing his diapers? I doubt I came into this world with that mission." "Everyone has their own path, Bernard. For me, spiritual development takes priority. By doing so, I'll contribute much more to our family. My spiritual mentor said that I'm a conduit, capable of channeling energy through myself and transforming it, giving people a new sense of life." "Have you ever encountered conduits, Bernard?" "Yes, I have. A month ago, on the train, a conductor first brought me a set of bed linens, then tea and sandwiches," the man replied, ignoring the disapproving looks from his wife and his father-in-law. After finishing their conversation, Bernard went to the kitchen, where an intoxicating smell of garlic roasted chicken wafted through the air. Gabriel declined dinner, saying that she no longer consumed animal products. Bernard smirked but refrained from making any comments. The girls were devouring the chicken with potatoes, displaying the gifts from their mother: vibrant necklaces and bracelets. It was evident how happy they were. And of course, it wasn't about the presents at all. Their mother was home, and whatever she might have been up to, as Bernard put it, the most important thing was that she was alive, genuine, and beside them. Kathryn finished her tea, contemplating the fact that she had now lost her father too. She had lost him in every sense, even if he recovered and lived for many more years. There was only one comforting thought: she believed that with Bernard's help, they would quickly gather information and find her mother. She deserved this gift of life. She had paid for it throughout the years of separation. Viola cleared the table and tried to avoid eye contact with Bernard, postponing an inevitable conversation. When Bernard left the kitchen and the girls dashed to their room, Kathryn finally asked the caregiver to sit down. Viola let out a deep sigh, turned off the water, and faced Kathryn. "Oh, Kathryn, to say that I'm ashamed is an understatement," the woman mumbled. "You see, I'm probably scared to look you in the eye. By and large, you haven't done anything terrible, Kathryn replied calmly, but did you at least understand that you became a part of a big scam? But how was I supposed to know what was really happening? Anderson intimidated me, and I was in a hopeless situation, Viola exclaimed. What do you mean hopeless? Kathryn was surprised. I've worked as a nurse in neurology all my life. I lived in a tiny apartment, and then my husband left my daughter, abandoned her with 2 little children. One's 3, the other is just 6 months old. And how was she supposed to work? The baby was breastfeeding, weak, always sick. They moved in with me, and I had to find a way to help them somehow. And so, in the hospital, I coincidentally ran into this Anderson while I was on a drip, and he offered me this job. I was overjoyed. The money was enormous for me, and with accommodations too. He gave me an advance. I immediately bought warm clothes for my grandchildren. But when I came here to you, he told me that the patient wasn't really that sick at all. He frightened me and said that if I worked and kept quiet, he would pay me well. But if I refused, or even worse, if I spoke up, anything could happen. Kathryn, what do you mean by anything? Did he threaten you? Kathryn became concerned. Well, how should I know? If Viola shrugged. This Anderson is a terrible person. Yes, well, you turned out to be much more insightful than me. Kathryn sadly smiled. Viola, I'm not blaming you for anything. It's good that you explained everything to me. I see how hard you tried, and the girls have grown attached to you. Maybe you could stay with us now. We'll need to take care of Dad properly, Kathryn suggested, but we'll need to agree on payment. I'm not sure we can pay you as much as Anderson did. Well, I'd be glad to, Kathryn. Viola hurried to her and hugged her. I'm even ready to help for free, just for food and accommodation. Oh no, that won't be necessary. Kathryn blushed. You don't have to do anything for free. I've grown accustomed to the fact that in this life, you have to pay for everything, sometimes even in advance, and it's often very expensive. Oddly enough, after all these events, the house was enveloped in tranquility. The new measures and order settled in quickly, as if nothing terrible had happened at all. Alexander remained in a consistently critical condition. According to the doctors, in his case, this was already considered good. The absence of negative dynamics itself was good news. However, no one was nervous anymore. In the case of this real stroke, only a few days had passed for Alexander, but in reality, his family had been living with the illusion of this situation for a month and a half. If they were to bring her father home again, everyone would already know how to care for him. By a bitter irony of fate, Alexander inadvertently prepared his relatives even for such a turn of events, forcing them to rehearse taking care of him during his forced charade. Viola took care of the house and looked after the girls. She made great efforts to be helpful in every way. Gabrielle, on the other hand, didn't annoy anyone with her meditations, incense, or strange conversations. She remained immersed in herself. Bernard spent his days behind his laptop, working remotely, and Kathryn simply waited. It took a few days for acquaintances of her husband to find out everything about her mother. As it turned out, during those terrifying days, Corey helped Kathryn's mother escape to Kazakhstan, where his acquaintance met her. While all of Iris's relatives were burying an empty casket, she was traveling from one city to another. Of course, nobody even thought of looking for her, but she didn't know that Alexander had already intimidated her in prison, and Anderson gave her clear instructions on how to cover her tracks. He gave her documents with a different name, enough money, and voiced the main condition: she had to disappear and not attempt to come back. When he learned that they were staging her funeral here, it was already too late. Corey inadvertently fell into the trap he himself had concocted. To claim that he helped a woman escape with fake documents would mean incriminating himself. Corey also couldn't accuse Iris's ex-husband of the funeral not being real, as that would have forced him to reveal the whole truth, especially since Alexander and Anderson knew that Corey had helped Iris. It was a vicious circle that couldn't be broken, otherwise many would have suffered. After a while, Iris went to the Czech Republic and settled in Prague. Kathryn took this information in with special reverence. It turned out that a few years ago she was very close to her mother and theoretically could have met her on the streets of this wonderful city. Now Kathryn understood why she felt so good in Prague. Previously, she thought that all her happy memories were because she met Bernard there, but now it was clear. There, she thought with her heart, which guided her on the right path. In the Czech Republic, Iris found work as an English language teacher at an international school, and a few years later, she married a colleague, a physics teacher named Martin. She kept her story hidden from him too, still fearing for her safety. After all, she was wanted in her home country. This lasted until the moment Martin was sent on a business trip to a scientific conference. He hurried to tell his wife, suggesting she could go with him to visit her relatives, about whom, however, he knew nothing. Of course, Iris refused at the time. That's when Martin began to investigate the cause of her odd behavior and the numerous mysteries associated with the subject of her homeland. Finally, Iris mustered the courage and shared with her husband the biggest secret of her life. This truly shocked Martin. The man decided to help his wife. Through acquaintances, he found people who could be contacted. In the case of the car explosion and Iris's subsequent fake death was brought out of the archives. That very invisible thread that connected Iris to her daughter only accelerated the events. If Kathryn hadn't randomly met Chad in the store, the reunion with her mother would have happened sooner or later. They were moving towards each other through time and unfortunate barriers. "I have two pieces of news for you, both good," Bernard whispered with a smile into his wife's ear as soon as Kathryn woke up in the morning. She sat up abruptly on the bed and eagerly looked at her husband. "Well, Bernard, spill the beans. Don't keep me waiting." "First news. They caught Anderson a few hours ago. He tried to leave the country. He's being interrogated now." "That's very good. I hope he won't be able to wriggle out of it this time." Kathryn breathed a sigh of relief. "Well, what's the second news?" "And here's the second news, my dear." Bernard handed his wife a piece of paper with a phone number and an unfamiliar country code. "You know whose number this is. Give them a call." Bernard kissed Kathryn and left the bedroom, leaving his spouse alone with the most precious digits she had seen in the last quarter of a century. It took her a few minutes to calm her trembling and start breathing steadily. Kathryn dialed the number, and after several rings that felt like an eternity, she heard the infinitely familiar voice on the other end of the line.